God never fails to meet us there on his end if we remain faithful to him. So MacArthur points out that Nehemiah acknowledged the true motive of his strategy to repopulate Jerusalem. From the very beginning, he says that my God put it into my heart. And we see a glorious piece of victory that Judah completed the walls of Jerusalem in only 52 days. And we're not going to read into the remaining half of Nehemiah, but we also see where they experienced revival after reading the law, after they had a reading of the law by Ezra, who reads the law. And they even celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. So again, in Nehemiah, we see a story of redemption, of rebuilding the wall. And again, if you read the rest of the book, we see the rebuilding of God's people coming back together and truly abiding by God's word. So now I would like to engage you guys in this activity just to get us a little more interactive. You guys, I handed out a little chart, and I'm all about visuals, and I feel like this will help us visualize not only to remember the story of Nehemiah itself, but also just to remind ourselves how others impact us in our lives, but how Nehemiah handles it, and then more importantly, what God does through it all. Okay. And again, this activity, it'll simplify the story itself, but it summarizes and identifies the actions of what others did, what Nehemiah does, and what God does. So we're going to break this down. Okay, and you guys can be filling it in as well. So if we remember in it was in chapter 4 and 6 where we really saw what others planned to do. We saw that they had mocked and despised. Oh my goodness, did I spell that right? Yeah. So they had mocked and despised. And then in case you guys want it, that was 4 verse 2. Others had plotted to fight and cause confusion. And we saw this in 4:8. So they had mocked and despised, they plotted to fight and cause confusion in the midst of the Jews themselves. They had lied, intended harm, hopefully on the real day I write a little better, and instill fear. We see this aspect of all the things that we experience: fear and doubt. And this was in chapter 6, verse 2 through 9. And then lastly, they wanted, specifically targeting Nehemiah himself, they wanted to shame and ruin the reputation of Nehemiah. And we saw this in chapter 6, verses 10 through 14. Okay, so we see these 4 things of what others had intended to do. These were the enemies, and these were just people living around the city of Judah. And yet, despite these things, we're going to look at and see what Nehemiah chooses to do. And focusing on the first 2 chapters, we saw first that Nehemiah wept and mourned. And this was because he was presented the sad news of his people and of his city. And yet he also fasted and prayed. We saw this all in 1:4. And then very clearly he spoke with the king. He spoke with the king. He even inspected the walls. He set guards as posts, and he gathered his people, set guards as posts. So you guys get the main idea. God had used him to carry out to take on the leadership and to initiate and carry out God's plan of the rebuilding of the wall and gathering his people again in Judah. I think most importantly, I think one of the most important things that Nehemiah does is that he ignores and remains focused. Ignores and remains focused and faithful to his work. And thus the Lord. To his word, and thus the Lord. I think this was a major point that we saw in Nehemiah's character and what he does. 4 times, again, if you guys recall in chapter 6, 4 times those people that he mentioned, they had come to him and tried to tell him to leave his work, to leave Judah. And yet his response was, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. And again, for the 5th time, they try to write him a letter. And sometimes we see tangible things, tangible evidence that sometimes makes us fear and doubt. But yet he says, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind. And so, again, Nehemiah recognizes that that it was false and it was just deceit. And then again, in chapter 6, verse 11, towards the end, we have people coming to him and saying that people are going to come and kill him, so they try to lure him into the temple. And yet he says firmly, I will not go in. Like, why should a man such as I run away? Because, again, he ignored the people, and he remained focused and faithful to his work, and thus to the Lord. Because he knew, again, from the very beginning, that God had put this mission in his heart, and God would carry it through. And again, in that way, like just looking at Nehemiah's actions and what he did, and how Nehemiah even translates to Yahweh comforts, like Nehemiah was comforted by that, and therefore strengthened by that as well. And then our last column here, we're just going to look at what God does. And God, we're going to have 4 main things that God does.
Hey, Julie.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
You're good.
30 minutes.
Is this time?
It's time.
Oh my gosh. I wasn't done. Okay. Ooh, okay. Okay. I had debated. Okay, pause. Yeah, I debated if I wanted to create a PowerPoint with slides so I don't have to write it all.
Right. That's an option.
Yeah, because I figured writing
will they
would
have
take a
that?
bit of time.
Well, I told Daniel to text Jeffrey to send him photos of all the rooms we're going to get.
Okay, good.
So we'll know what technology we
Okay.
have,
Okay.
and whoever wants to claim a
Right.
PowerPoint or the technology
Right.
first, and they'll
They
get it
can
first
do that.
hand.
Yeah, because I was like, I know writing's going to take a whole lot of time already.
Yeah, I know we talked about that yesterday, but I don't know if he actually did it though.
Oh, okay.
So I'll remind
Well-
him.
They say that they have PowerPoints.
No, just for enough for everyone. For
My
everyone.
closing applications
There's
will
like
be at the end.
For each time. For each time.
But yes. Okay, I guess, yeah. Should I think 'cause she is
So,
next.
let me give you something.
Oh, yes.
Right? So, outstanding. I mean, very, very well done. And I love how you broke this up like this, and I love the passages that you did. So I think the structure that you have is really very, very strong, right? I don't know how much public speaking they have you do over in the nursing program.
Oh, yeah?
But what I'm going to recommend is it's not, so these guys are not allowed to be reading that much because you're
Oh,
trained for
yeah.
that, but you're fine with that.
Okay,
But
yeah.
I'm going to encourage you to do what we call reading eye contact.
Reading icon.
So in other words, knowing your notes well enough that if you're going to read them, you can come up at the end of the sentence and then go back
And
down.
go back down, yeah.
And you were doing that sometimes.
Okay.
And it worked really well.
Okay.
When you get too tied to it, then you lose the connection with me.
Okay.
So, and if you're going to want to scan the room as much as possible, you're doing that quite a bit. You're
Okay.
looking at different people.
Yeah.
That makes you nervous, look at their forehead,
Yeah.
and it will look like you're looking at their eyes.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Really? Seriously?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't tell when you look at the forehead.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so that's a way to kind of get over some of that nervousness sometimes.
Yeah.
The other thing that you want to do is find the people who are tracking with you.
Okay.
People who are nodding, people who are
Oh, yeah.
clearly watching you and listening,
Mhm.
and just focus on them.
Okay.
That will be an encouragement to you.
Okay.
The people who are sleeping aren't
Right.
sleeping because of you. They're sleeping because they stayed up too late last night. Ignore them.
Let's
Okay?
Talking about our
Ignore that.
classics.
That's what I tell my own professors. I'm like, I'm just tired, but
Yeah, no,
I love this. Yeah.
The other thing I would recommend, I'm sorry, in somewhere in your notes in chapter 2,
Okay.
you were talking about them still being in Persia, but actually by chapter 2, Nehemiah is already in Israel.
Nehemiah's already in Israel.
Yeah.
So when he's
So
talking
just-
to the king.
When he's talking to Sanballat, he's in Israel already.
Oh, okay.
And you had said that, then he went, but he's already looked at the walls and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay.
So it's just a really
Just
minor,
minor.
just a minor thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Make note of that.
So,
Oh.
do you need a pen?
Oh, that's okay. I'll do it later.
All right. You have really good material, but we gotta get done within 30 minutes.
I know.
And you really
Okay,
wanna-
I think
and you
this
wanna
took a
get
long
to the
time.
conclusion.
Yes. Yeah. My
So, PowerPoint will help with that if you get that chance,
Mhm.
okay? But another option, it would mean restructuring it a little bit, so you'd have to think through this. But another option for you might be read chapter 1 and then ask the people, what did others do? What did Nehemiah
Oh,
do?
yeah.
What did God do?
Okay.
Now you don't have to necessarily write it on the board.
Okay.
You just tell people, yeah, write that down.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says, well, Nehemiah prayed, yes.
Mhm.
Nehemiah prayed, put that under, for this verse. And then
Yeah.
you're letting them write the material and you're getting feedback, right?
Yeah.
Now, because they're high school, junior high, high school,
Yeah.
early college age, they may not talk a lot real quick.
Yeah.
So for chapter 1, you may need to say, well, look, here, Nehemiah prayed.
Mhm.
But he also wept and mourned, and he fasted, okay?
Yeah.
So you might have to kind of stir the pot a little bit. For
Okay.
it, all right?
Yeah. No.
But I think if you
that's
did
good.
that, you avoid all of this.
All that.
And by the time you get done, now you're gonna need to cut down on some of the stuff that you wrote.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah.
So what I would recommend is like for each chapter, read it, ask them to fill out those parts,
Mhm.
and then maybe in your notes, have the most important stuff highlighted.
Mhm.
And so if you get absolutely no response, you can fill it in.
Yeah. Okay.
But if you get a lot of response, oh, I don't have time for all this other stuff, but this highlighted thing, I have to say this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does.
And then I think that way you're going to get a lot of interaction.
Interaction.
These are actually really easy verses for people to
Yeah.
figure out what's going on.
What's going on? Yep.
So I cannot imagine that they will be
It's
too
like,
silent.
yeah.
Like the answers are fairly obvious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you don't have to do it that way, but I think you
Yeah.
get a lot more interaction. You avoid the slowing down because I don't doubt where you're going with this, that you want the interaction because now you've set it up to say, okay, are you ever mocked and despised? Are people ever kind of trying to cause you
Yeah.
confusion? Have you been lied to? Have people tried to harm you? Have they tried to instill fear in you? Now all of a sudden you've set it up where the students are going, yeah, I've got people who are trying to shame me at school.
Yeah.
And you can say, okay, this is what Nehemiah does,
Oh.
and this is what you can trust God to do.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you've set it up for him, and the notes are sitting right in front of him. It's like, look at what happens. These are what people are doing to you.
Yeah.
If you act in this way, you can be certain that God's going to act the way He does in that last column. And now your conclusion's right there, and you've given
Yeah.
them something to walk away with. So.
Yeah, or I was even considering like, should I even just already have the chart filled out so they can just visually see it?
No, I think
Okay.
getting that interaction,
interaction.
that gets them thinking about it.
Okay,
So,
yeah. Okay, then I
Good.
will restructure that. Okay.
Excellent
Yeah.
job visually.
Okay.
Very, very well done.
Thank you.
Good job.
Okay.
Should I restart this thing?
No, it was
Oh my gosh, I
recorded.
really don't want that.